This is Women Talking Mitzvot, brought to you by Deracheha and the Stella K. Abraham Migdal Oz Women's Beit Midrash as part of their commitment to bringing women's spiritual worlds into halachic discourse. This entire podcast series has been graciously sponsored by Sigal and Zach in honor of Women's Talmud Torah, Women's Halacha Study, and in merit of Am Yisrael. All of these episodes draw on the rich sources and discussions of women and mitzvot on Deracheha.org. This episode explores the meaning and halachic obligation of reciting Birkat ha-mazon after eating bread, and discusses the halachic parameters of starting off the bentching with a Zimmun when in the presence of 3 or more men or women. This episode has been sponsored in gratitude to the Women Talking Mitzvot podcast and its host by the Buchman community in Modi'in. Thank you for addressing such important topics with sensitivity, knowledge, and care. And I'll just say, it's our pleasure. Hi, Shayna.
Hi, Yosefa.
Today we're here to talk about Birkat ha-mazon, which is a great topic, I think, in my heart, because first of all, it's relevant to all of us, right? Mm-hmm. All us men and women, are saying Birkat ha-mazon in our daily lives. And there are some really specific dimensions to this that are directly relevant to women, and I think often come up in conversations about women's involvement in their mitzvah observance. Mm-hmm. So I'm happy to be talking about this topic today. And Birkat ha-mazon, just to make sure we're all on the same page, is the bracha that we recite after eating bread. On one hand, it's a really straightforward mitzvah. We eat bread, we say Birkat ha-mazon after. It's derived from the Torah verses in Sefer Dvarim in Perek Chet Pasuk Yud, in chapter 8 Pasuk 10. Achanta v'savata u'virachta et Hashem Elokecha ala haaretz hatova asher natan lach. That you eat, and if you're full, then you also bless God. And from there we derive halachically that after a meal that includes bread, which is what is classically considered to be filling, so we also make a blessing and thank Hashem. Noticeably in the Pasuk, we're thanking Hashem for the land that gave us all of this good. So we're going to see how Eretz Yisrael really figures prominently in these brachot. And so this is a mitzvah, I like to say mitzvah we say with our mouth, meaning some mitzvot we do, but this is one of those that we recite. It's something that we use our mouth as our tool to fulfill the mitzvah. It doesn't cost. It doesn't have any,
nice part.
Yeah, it's a nice part of it. It doesn't have any sort of trappings or surroundings to it. I would say, as opposed to last week's conversation about makeup, which sort of focused on an object per se. And I think what's also really interesting about Birkat ha-mazon is that it's one of these mitzvot that has a serious social element to it. Meaning, I think often it's a mark of where people are holding in their conscientious observance, right? Of if people are makpid to say Birkat ha-mazon. And I think that on one hand, it sort of can be a marker of, where people are standing in their mitzvah observance. Sometimes it's seen as that. On the other hand, I think it's something that we know is easy to be lax about, meaning it's something that takes effort and more time after someone eats, and also something that communally in some spaces it's given more weight than others.
Right.
None of this reflects anything about the halachic element of it. We'll talk about that, but I think just socially, those pieces stick out for me. And one thing I'll just say, and then I really want to hear your thoughts about it in terms of the way Birkat ha-mazon meets us in our communities, is that something I think I say often about this piece of habit. Birkat ha-mazon is one of these mitzvot that I think that if we grew up kind of ingrained with it, then it's something that is just there and available. I think I mentioned this when we were speaking about washing hands, or there's certain things that to me, they're really successful when they're done as a habit, and they're really challenging to take them on. Again, I think some are harder than others. I really do think that. And Birkat ha-mazon, there's something about it that really is like an effort in something that seems kind of natural or intuitive, like eating a meal. And therefore, I think it's like a gift if we were able to have that, accessible to us, and it was something that was ingrained, and then it's, something that we'll just be able to keep doing, or be able to do it in a way that we know it by heart already.
It's interesting the point that you're making, because it's true that Birkat ha-mazon doesn't cost anything in terms of money. You don't have to go out and buy that etrog or get the oil to light your Hanukkah candles. But it does take up time. It does take up space and time. And, in a world where people like to say things like time is money, so then it does require investment, and it does require giving it a certain amount of attention. it's one of those mitzvot that we meet up with when we're very young. If we're growing up in an observant world, it's something that children encounter early on. And that's maybe, part of what you mean when you say that it's like a marker of observance. It's a marker of frumkeit, because it's part of what ends up defining our day-to-day lived experience as religious observant Jews. So we know that especially in school environments and camp environments, oftentimes they'll have their students and their campers sing bentching out loud. And at family meals, especially like more formal family meals, like if a family's sitting down for a Shabbat lunch and they have guests over, many times people will sing Birkat ha-mazon, or at least that first paragraph of Birkat ha-mazon, they'll sing it together, which takes time. Which, as I say, as an aside, I find it fascinating that that first paragraph of Birkat ha-mazon, Hazanet Olam, that one, has this tune that has somehow like succeeded in crossing lines in terms of like different segments of the Orthodox community and beyond the Orthodox community. Yeah. There's all different segments of our Jewish community that seem to sing that same tune. It's like one of those tunes that you're like, it must be around forever. Like, when is it from? So in preparing this episode, I kind of went down a rabbit hole, honestly, about looking up, where is this from? And I remembered something like hearing when I was a kid that it came from the camp world, and started exploring, which led to me playing all kinds of funny YouTube videos about random people. My kids were like, what are you listening to? What are you playing? Why do you keep having bentching on? So it was an interesting experience. And through that, I found out all kinds of information from different articles on the internet, one of which was especially helpful that we will link to in the show notes, that the familiar tune that we often sing was written in 1938. So like, it's not from Matan Torah. It goes back only to 1938 by a man named Moshe Nathanson, who was raised Orthodox in Yerushalayim, but then moved to America. And he's also credited, by the way, with another very well-known tune, which is he had a hand in composing Hava Nagila. And when he came to America, he was the cantor of the Reconstructionist Society for the Advancement of Judaism in New York. But in the summer, he worked as a music counselor in the first Hebrew-speaking sleepaway camp, which was called Camp Achva. Mm-hmm. Now, in camp, where, as both of us having spent time in sleepaway camp, you sit down, like the mealtime is a big part of like what you do during the day, and you sit down for meals. And oftentimes in camp, there's bread is a big filler, so a lot of people end up washing. And as the music director, he was inspired to think about how could we make this like more exciting and more interesting. And he wrote what he thought was a lively camper-friendly melody for the first paragraph of bentching. And the campers ended up really getting into it. And ultimately, when the camp closed, this Camp Achva, so a lot of the cultural norms of the camp found their way into a new camp, which was one of the first modern Orthodox camps called Camp Masad in 1941. And then in 1947, when the conservative movement started Camp Ramah, many of the staffers came from Camp Masad, and they brought the bentching with them. So basically,
that explains the cross-denomination.
That's how it ended up crossing into different denominations. And then because this fellow Moshe Nathanson also taught at Yeshiva Flatbush and Crown Heights Yeshiva, so he ended up bringing the tune also into the Yeshiva day school. So basically by the 1950s, it was like completely already all over the place. And I actually saw in that article that Rabbi Haskell Lookstein, who's well known from Ramaz and from KJ in New York City. So he speaks about how he learned the tune in Camp Masad, and he said it was like really great because all of a sudden you had all these children who knew all the words to Birkat ha-mazon by heart. On the other hand, he did comment, though, that in the process we lost the grandeur of Birkat ha-mazon, which I thought was interesting because meaning what he's saying is there's something fun and something great about knowing something, by heart. But when you're in camp and there's like banging on the table or there's the hand motions that we do, so sometimes you forget to think about the words. And certainly, if we're talking about English-speaking kids who the Hebrew isn't natural for them, I could understand, that that's the trade-off. And at the same time, like we want our kids, to know this. So I thought that was really fascinating.
Totally. There's actually two things that came up. I'll address the last part first, which is that my kids who've never been in a sleepaway camp, but at some point we did teach them the hand motions for the last paragraph of, right, Yerut Hashem. Exactly. And so one time my daughter, I think she was like in fourth grade, and they were, I guess, saying Birkat ha-mazon in school, and she started doing the hand motions, and her teacher yelled at her, and she said, "You're making a mockery of the tefillah." And no, but I thought it was hilarious. She looked at her, she's like, "I don't know. We do this in my house. I don't know." So
literally, an adult in his 40s just told me that he has this memory of like also being yelled at by his elementary school principal for doing the hand motions with the same kinds of.
So I think that's really funny. But I think that the story, which is fascinating in terms of like the way it's spread. But see, the thing is, Shane, is that there are a lot of trends that can happen in camp, but they don't spread into everyday life. But I think what that story shows is how much the Jewish world needed a way to bring this into the educational setting, and it wouldn't just be, so now say all those paragraphs, meaning it's really hard. It's very long. We'll talk about that. It's very long, and I think that so the way that it kind of spread like wildfire, there's lots of tunes out there. There's lots of songs. Now, do all things, cross borders like that? I don't think so. But I think it really spoke probably to a really real need. Mealtime is a thing. Mealtimes happen in schools. And it was a way to take a mitzvah that's hard in those settings and make it something that's experiential. So I think that that's like a really important piece. And I think it speaks to also some of the challenges of Birkat ha-mazon. One other thing I'll add in terms of, I guess, like my personal history with Birkat ha-mazon, and I'm sure that I'm not alone in this, is that in my home, benching was a thing we did on Shabbat. It was a Shabbat activity, just like shul was a thing we did on Shabbat. I imagine that was pretty mainstream for that era of, American Orthodoxy affiliated. And so I always knew how to bench. And we also, I think maybe when I was little, we said that out loud, but usually we said it to ourselves. Also, I was the youngest. So by the time you get to the youngest kid, those things usually peter out. But that was what to me was a thing you did on Shabbat, and I didn't really know more than that. And I would just say that, well, this is not at all, I think, what was going through my parents' mind. I think that they were just doing what they had done when they were little, and that made sense. I will say, as somebody who we have a home where benching is an everyday thing, right? Meaning whether bracha rishona, brachot we say before we eat, and brachot after, whether it's Birkat ha-mazon or al mechia or bein nefashot, is something that we always do. I will say that from a chinuch perspective, it's really hard to teach kids, because I think I've spent well over a decade reminding my children and saying to them, okay, don't forget the bench, and throwing them a bencher. And it's really hard. Like, in the end of the day, like there is an element of like the habit automated thing, but you do have to have a moment of consciousness, or you finish eating. Just like you can tell
become habits if you work to ingrain them.
Exactly. And I just realized, I specifically with brachot, whether bracha rishona and achrona, and including benching, I find it really difficult. To me, it's just as hard as teaching your kids to put their plates in the sink. They're good people, but like there's something you have to take what is an automated pe'ula, an automated action, which is eating, and then switch to like a conscious moment. And I see how challenging that is, because I really am really consistent about reminding them.
And it's home very late from a wedding last night and found like the pot still filled with noodles and their dishes. Everything was out. It was like, and they're wonderful children. But yes, these habits, even if you talk about them all the time, like just making them part of your day-to-day life is
and put up signs. We have signs, we have pictures. I mean, but it doesn't matter, because there's something in like this mental space that the person still has to decide to do it. It's not as automatic, I think, as we might think initially. It's not the same as the eating part. And I think that is an important piece to put out there.
Okay. And you still nag them.
Yeah, and I hate nagging. I don't like to be that parent, but I also know that it gets ingrained at a certain point, and I see which kid it has or hasn't been ingrained in yet. And so being nagging is annoying, but I think it's important. And I guess the question is, why do I think it's important? Meaning, why do I keep, nagging, or why do I keep at it, or why do I keep, focus on it? And I think that on one hand, on a simple halachic level, like saying Birkat ha-mazon after eating bread is a doraita obligation. Like it's up there on the chamurot, like meaning it's a serious mitzvah. And it's not something I'm willing to just like let go. And I think though, when it comes to all the other, whether bracha achrona for ala mechia for mizonot related foods, or bein nefashot for all shehakol related other foods, and brachot before we eat, for me, I still think it's really important to remind them, because for me, it also has this identity marker to it. Like I said earlier, like this marker of frumkeit also, as you had said, like I think that it's also, meaning I think it's halachically important, but I think that it's also a really big consciousness molder.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
Meaning a marker for themselves,
for
not just for
themselves.
other people.
Yes.
For
No, no,
them.
no. For themselves,
Mm-hmm.
not for other people. I don't think most people aren't noticing if someone's mumbling something nothing to do with other people. I think that it's a really big personal molder in being in Ovedet Hashem, in
Committed.
being committed, bringing God into these small acts. In theory, ideally, it creates a gratitude mindset if we really are conscious about what we're doing and not just mumbling the words, but I'll even just take mumbling the words if that's what I'm going to get. And I think that it's something, yes, sometimes like dress, again, not for the outside, but for the person. I think that
That affects you.
and it's every day. It's every day, multiple times a day. And so to me, it's one of these mitzvot that there's something very enveloping about it. And I really want it to be, and again, they're obviously going to make their own choices as they grow, but I feel like, yes, it's a mitzvah that it's worth pushing for, because I think it has a very big impact on how a person sees themselves vis-a-vis their avodat Hashem. And also it's a way to communicate with God.
I totally agree with you. First of all, that in terms of the reality of the situation in many segments of our community, not just in the 80s and 90s when we were growing up, but today, meaning benching is only something that you do at the end of a big formal meal, and usually specifically on Shabbat, or on a Chag, or maybe in school or in camp, as I said. I'll speak about it for a minute from the other side, because I grew up in a home where my parents did raise us to say Birkat ha-mazon after any meal that included bread, also during the week, and they would hand us, the bencher, the Birkon, and we would do our best to say it to ourselves. Like, we wouldn't sing it out loud during the week, but as a little girl, I remember that challenge of navigating being at friends' houses where washing and benching was not a given, and feeling this like responsibility of like, I know that I'm supposed to wash and bench, but I didn't want to be too conspicuous about it, both because I didn't want to be like the for me, who was like weird and different, and also because I didn't want to be holier than thou and like make people feel bad that they weren't doing something. So it took time, like as I got older and got more comfortable owning my identity and finding sensitive ways to do what I thought was right. But when I was little, there was like a lot of like sneaking into the bathroom to wash, or like mumbling quickly under my breath. And yeah, like as I was thinking about this, like, wow, it all came back to me, the birthday parties and the lunches and yeah, I mean, I had an amazing childhood and upbringing, but that part of it wasn't simple, because it's not something that is, part of everybody's day-to-day life. Something else that I noticed that's really interesting is that the Torah specifically tells us that we should bless God after we eat, and that all those other brachot, all those other blessings that you were talking about that we say before we eat, that we say on food, like mizonot or shakol, hadam, ha'et, those brachot were actually only instituted later by the Rabbanan, and they're not a biblical obligation. And I think it's possible that this idea of the achalta v'savata ubarachta, that you should eat and you should feel full and then you should bless God, maybe is emphasizing the idea that sometimes people think of a relationship with God as this entity or being that you turn to when you need something, when you have a request, when you're in a time of trouble, when something's difficult for you. And the Torah is basically coming and telling us that the only like real bracha that is instituted here on a Deracheha, on a biblical level, is actually from a place of gratitude, from a place of satisfaction, from a place of being able, even when we are feeling like life is good and I'm full, that also then we're able to turn to God, which I think is very significant and ties into the idea of gratitude that you touched on a little bit. And also, I think another element here that is very, noteworthy is that basically what we're doing by benching is that we're taking like a regular mundane meal and we're turning it into some kind of religious act, which ties into also other concepts that we raised when we spoke about Kiddush and other things, like taking something that's neutral, something that's very physical, perhaps even something that maybe someone would say is base or animalistic or is part of what it means to be human and not godly, the fact that we have to eat in order to survive. And we're saying like we could elevate this act by recognizing that it's not a given that we have food to eat and that we could thank God for that. And I think there's so many different components of eating that we know come up in life. Sometimes it's just people need to eat in order to survive. Sometimes it's a pleasurable or even a social activity that we do with friends and loved ones and family members. Sometimes it's an intimate experience if we're sitting down at a date or we're sitting down with a friend, and we're really bonding and having a very deep conversation and we do it over food, there's something that connects us through that act. And then we know that there's also the part of eating that sometimes has an emotional aspect to it, in the sense of like that there's foods that we find comforting, or there's foods that remind us of different things and have certain those nice things. Exactly. Like, so whether it's Shabbat and challah or chicken soup, or it's the kreplach that my mother made specifically for the meal on Erev Yom Kippur, or the stuffed cabbage on Sukkot that we had, or in our family, since my sister was little, like in kindergarten, she came home with this like hot pretzel recipe that my mother started making after every fast to break our fast on. And to this day, like I brought into, so like those pretzels for my kids, like symbolize the end of a fast day. And there's all these associations that people have with food. And in addition to that, if we could associate with food the fact that God, cares about us, and he's with us, and he gives to us, and he has a presence in our life, and we, are able to acknowledge that and be grateful for that, I think that is something very, very special. And then like that tune of like singing together in that joyful way, I think could enhance, that feeling if we're already tapped into that gratitude element.
I think also if you take the logic you just said right now about v'achalta v'savata, that it's, when you're full and things are good, you thank God. I think that the wisdom of the other enactments of Chazal to make brachot when it's not necessarily, again, in theory, because they're looking at bread as being the big filler, but you also thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu when things are partial, right? Or when it's a partial meal, or I think that like those...
That's great.
I think that there's a really important piece that they probably saw a need to fill in, right? Meaning, this persimmon is unbelievable, so why wouldn't I, say something before and then also say something after to God? I don't know, sometimes Christian things come up for me, but I just want to say one thing, right? We grew up and we saw movies of people who would say grace before meals, right? And its translation in a lot of the Birkonim is grace after meals, right? Okay, because it's really working off of that same language. Grace is a completely Christian word. It's not a well used English word for Jewish practice. But I always I remember thinking that there was like something very powerful about, we also all make brachot, but the together piece. Like in the movies, okay, so they all stay for a moment, they put their hands together, and they all have kavanah together at the same time. And I'm not saying I'm doing that practice, but I really like the Birkat ha-mazon, or even B'nai Nefashot that we say out loud, or Al Micha we say out loud in my house, because it's also the thanking and it's also together. Yeah. Because usually it's like, you'll make your bracha because you're eating your food and I'll make my bracha. But at the end, we all say it together. And I think that just like it always kind of caught me, like in the movie part, like the Christian household with their grace before meals, because I think the together piece.
The only time we really do that is Kiddush and Chotzi.
Exactly. And we do. Right. And I think that there's something powerful about it. Like it's just the act of being together in that moment. And so I like that, at least in our home, we try to say those brachot together afterward, because I think it's just a nice option to be able to like share that moment of gratitude together. Okay, so I want us to really get into sort of how Birkat ha-mazon took form, right? How it became, how it developed, and how we have what we have today. And I guess it's just a little intro sentence to looking at the different parts, is that it is long, Shayna. And I just want to recognize that, people sometimes think like, oh, I think it's long. Yeah. And it's a challenge.
But in our busy lives, it's long.
It's long. And like, it could be a challenge. And I really recognize that. And and kids in Gan, they're learning how to say Birkat ha-mazon. So at least I could say in Israel. So they say the first bracha, and then they skip to Uvenei Yerushalayim, and then they say Oseh Shalom, and then they have a really sweet little tefillah they say at the end of thanking their parents for making them their food.
It's nice.
Yes, I think it's really nice. I think it's a lovely length. And I think that, and so I'm just saying that, so I want us to look into this because I think it's important to see the significance of the different parts. Right. Because
what are we actually saying?
What are we actually saying, and why are there so many paragraphs? So that's just, I want to put that out there and just identify with all of us out there who feel like, well, I'm an older person, but I still think that this is a long bracha. And certainly that's true
we see you.
We see you. And we definitely understand that. For kids, it's also a challenge. Okay. So how do we get from v'achalta v'savata u'verachta to what we actually have today? And so we actually have two kind of origin stories in the Gemara. So the first sugya in the Gemara attributes each of the paragraphs to a different biblical figure, basically suggesting that this is a bracha that grew over time, right? Meaning that it had different elements to it and that they were added at different moments in our earlier history. So this is said in the name of Rav Nachman, that Moshe enacted the first bracha, which was called Birkat Hazan, is the right he who sustains. And this was the first bracha when the man descended for Am Yisrael in the desert. And again, obviously depicting the very basic sense that God gives us our sustenance. Yoshua enacted Birkat Haaretz, which is the second bracha over the land when they enter the land of Israel. David and Shlomo enacted the bracha of Bonei Yerushalayim, right, Uvnei Yerushalayim, etc. That this is when we have the Yerushalayim being built. David HaMelech establishes Ir David. Shlomo actually builds the Beit Mikdash, so there's a partnership between them that has to do with this bracha. And the fourth bracha, which is Hatov Amitiv, he who does good and who is good and does good. So that's the fourth bracha, and it was said to be enacted by Chazal, and it was enacted in Yavne as a response to all of those that had been killed in Beitar. And there's a further drasha which says that the phrase Hatov is thanking God for the fact that the bodies had not rotted, and Hamitiv, right, that and he who continues to do good is that they also could be buried. I think that obviously our lives in the past few years have recognized so deeply the importance of bringing bodies to burial, and that we recognize that there is really a different stage, right? When there is a gap between when people are killed and when they're buried, there is a tremendous relief that we have when they're able to be brought to rest fully.
It's so interesting how at different times in our life, like these kinds of things hit us in different ways. Because I remember when I first heard that and you're like, okay, like a whole bracha was established, for that. And then when you're living it and there's literally people who are waiting for their bodies of their loved ones to be buried, all of a sudden it resonates very deeply.
Totally. And that's the first source that speaks about the way that the bracha develops. And then there's another source that actually looks at each of the parts of the Birkat ha-mazon and attributes them a different pasuk, meaning that it's not necessarily only, again, these can coexist, these two ideas, that it was also figures who enacted the brachot, and also that each of them also has a root in the Torah. I encourage anyone who wants to see more of these sources to look at the psukim inside. Of course, you can always check out the articles that are always linked in the show notes to the Deracheha website. But I just wanted to summarize really briefly the different ideas, right, that are included in the bracha of Birkat ha-mazon. We have the idea that God sustains us. That's the first bracha of Hazanat HaKol. And that's, again, I would say like this universal piece, right, that God sustains all of us with the food that he gives us. We have the bracha of haaretz, which is thanking God for giving us the land. And that, of course, connects right back to the initial pasuk we saw, which is thanking Hashem when we're full, right, for the land he has given us. That's really directly in that initial pasuk in Devarim that we saw. We have the bracha of Bonei Yerushalayim for rebuilding of Yerushalayim. And also the fourth bracha that we saw is recognizing God's good even in situations that are really, really difficult. And I think that that's another piece that's really significant, meaning to lift it from the specific context of Beitar, but it's a bracha that just recognizes God's good even when life sometimes is very, very challenging. So those are all sort of these themes that come up in the brachot. And I think that the centrality of Eretz Yisrael is a very important part also, meaning it sits there in a significant part in the bracha. And as I said, it's really in the initial context of the bracha itself. It's a bracha that's not tluya ba'aretz, we say anywhere we are, but it still features constantly in our bracha. And by the way, I would say kind of similar to how it does in the Amidah, meaning also our Amidah that we say in the morning, we also have elements of these themes that come up there, meaning it's like we're thanking God for this food, but no matter what we are eating, we're broadening the perspective. We're always bringing in all these other themes as well, which I think is very significant and meaningful.
Yeah. And then in terms of where women come in this, so first of all, women are definitely obligated to recite Birkat ha-mazon. So it's important to say that right off the bat. The Mishnah and the Gemara make this clear. There is no opinion that exempts women from Birkat ha-mazon. Women are obligated. At minimum, they're obligated rabbinically, and many authorities really hold that verse that we saw in the Torah, V'alchata v'savata v'rachta, also applies to them, and that they have the same Torah obligation just as men do. The reason that there's some thought that maybe women are not obligated on a Torah level is because some of the key themes that you just mentioned, so like there's Brit Milah, right? I think we say we nick Hashem for the Brit that he
ingrained in our bodies,
on our skin, in our flesh. So that's obviously not a mitzvah that applies directly to women. And then there's also talk about the mitzvah of Talmud Torah that women are maybe formally exempt from on like a pure level of Talmud Torah. We know that also that gift of Eretz Yisrael, the initial distribution in terms of the nachalot and the different portions. Women weren't given their own portion of the land until the notes had come, and they, talk about how that should be relevant to them. Some authorities argue, therefore, that it can't be that women are obligated to say a text if the text includes parts that don't really directly apply to them. And there are poskim like the Ramah who even rule that women should not recite those lines when they are saying the text. The Mishnah Berurah, however, says that it's a common custom for women to say these lines. And I think that's what we see, that indeed, the common accepted practice in many of our communities is that women do mention this because even if it's not directly relevant to them, it's relevant to us as part of a broad community. Yeah. The same way that sometimes when we're not obligated in a mitzvah, we'll still say, Asher Kedishanu b'mitzotav v'tzivanu, that Hashem commanded us, meaning commanded us as a nation. So the Shulchan Aruch rules at the end of the day that women are obligated to bench, but he leaves this issue of the level of their obligation, whether it's biblical or rabbinic, unresolved. What I think this means, though, is that still women should understand that we're full participants in this mitzvah. We're not guests who are opting in voluntarily. This is not like those mitzvah de seisha man grama, the time-bound mitzvah where women we know do not have an obligation to do them, but they could decide to. Here, we're considered full participants, and I think we should take that obligation very seriously.
I think that a few other points that also come up for me in terms of just like the act of benching. So one is that it really formalizes the meal to a certain degree, definitely. And like you said that before on a Shabbat or everyone's benching together. And of course, Zimmun will play into this and we'll get to that. We'll get to that very soon. This idea of opening the benching with like a specific opening that everyone engages with. But I think that there are also a few pieces here that I just want to add like as like a modern iteration of how this meets us. First of all, I think that if we're going to be mindful about trying to say Birkat ha-mazon and be conscious about the mitzvah, I think there's also an element in general about like being conscious about like how we're eating, even to the fact of like if my child is gonna start saying Birkat ha-mazon and they're kind of like standing up on the side of the room, like no, you need to come sit down and say Birkat ha-mazon. Also, they have to be able to see the place that we're in, but you should do it formally. And I think it also comes to
not on the run.
Not on the run. It also has to do with how we eat. Like very often we eat on the run, and eating on the run is not a good thing. Like most of us should, in our hearts and minds and bodies, we need to take 5 minutes to have an actual meal if we're talking about during the week, or more than that, of course. So I think that it also gives us an opportunity to kind of reflect upon, like, how does our meal look? Meaning, am I in that big of a rush that I like have, that it's so, I'm saying this to myself, Yosefa, I'm not giving anybody else a rebuke. Like, is it so hard for me? It is, by the way. Is it so hard for me to take 7 minutes out so that like I'm eating for 6 and I'm saying Birkat ha-mazon for 1? And that, like, why is that so hard for me? Like, what does my life look like that like I can't manage to like, eat something normally? I really think about that because in general, how I fit in meals is something that I find to be a challenge. I can easily like just kind of ignore them for a long time because I'm just busy doing something.
I just feel like are we able to just be? Because sometimes even when we're eating, we need to have our phone in front of us. We need to be reading. We need to, it's like, could just eat and be and either talk to the people that we're with or just take it as a time to reflect, experiment.
Yeah.
Not simple.
No, it's not. It's not simple at all. I think that also two things that are interesting here. One is that there is a lot of like washing, benching. I almost want to say like fears. Yeah. They're like avoidance.
What we just said.
Exactly. So a lot of people will like not eat bread on purpose or
but
right.
They don't have to bench.
They don't have to bench or they like the whole washing piece. And it just feels like it's difficult for people. And so there's a lot of times people will like avoid it for that reason. And another thing I just want to say is that there are a lot of people out there who don't eat gluten or who aren't eating bread because of weight, diet, whatever, regiment concerns they have. And so it's, and this is something that I've thought about a lot over the years, but it really shifts things. By the way, a big piece where it comes up, let's say, is on Sukkot. Like I could easily go almost all of Sukkot except the Chag and not wash for bread. And I remember learning, Rav Melamed writes in his book that you could still say Alei Sheva Sukkah if you're having a meal, even doesn't have bread. And I remember I was very relieved to hear that because I didn't like that what my meal is in kavua. Of course, this is my meal. This is how my meal looks, just doesn't include that bread. And so that piece is also interesting because it means that a lot of people, again, whether because of a dietary issue or out of choice, are not necessarily washing for beds. They're not saying Birkat ha-mazon. And in that case, I would want to say that we can apply the same things we've said now to the bracha achrona, meaning saying al michya and brei nefashot, those two brachot achronot, I think are also could fill a related role in terms of that opportunity to tap into like being and being present. And you could still take out a bencher, you know what I'm saying, and focus on the words. I think that it's also really, it's an equal opportunity in my eyes.
Mm-hmm. I want to come back now to what you said earlier about eating together, because you said that there's something powerful, that we pick up on in movies sometimes about like there's something that formalizes a meal, or it definitely feels more ritual when it includes an act of like everybody joining together in some kind of blessing. And I think the halacha also recognizes this. The Mishnah tells us that when you sit down for a meal with 3 or more people who are eating together, and at least 2 of the 3 have had bread, then we don't just bench separately anymore. It's not like each person is just on their own, but there's actually an obligation to pause and take a moment and formally invite one another into a shared act of blessing that we refer to as Zimmun. Now, we spoke a little bit before about how Birkat ha-mazon is centered around gratitude, and that gratitude idea, which has come up in several episodes of ours, it's very, very deep for us as Jews, meaning as Jews, we're called Yehudim, and Yehudim comes from the name Yehuda, which was the name that Leah gave to her 4th son, and it comes from the Hebrew word lehodot, the verb of to thank and to acknowledge. And when Yehuda was born, Leah said, "Hapam oded Hashem," that this time I'm going to give thanks. And in that way, she really like embedded that word of gratitude into the name of her son. And over time, the people who came from that tribe and then formed the kingdom of Judah, and they carried that name forward until Yehudi just became the word, for a Jew. And in this way, when we think about like who we are, it's not just like, okay, we're called Yehudim. It's like, it's literally part of our identity to be a people who have a certain kind of awareness, a certain kind of humility, a certain kind of ability to focus on Thanksgiving, and it's a core part of who we are. And therefore, there's a lot of practices that we see, in our lives as Jews that definitely come back to this idea. And when we're benching, we see that there's a sense that it's even deeper when it's shared, that there's something that deepens that experience of gratitude when we do it together with other people, that perhaps the Gemara seems to be saying that there's something spiritually different when we turn to the people that we're with and we say, Rabotai or Chavirotai Nivarech, let us come, let us bless together. Maybe because it makes it more like public, maybe because it's more formal, maybe because we're then like accountable as a group in some way. But definitely there's this sense that when we praise God as a group, we're magnifying our acknowledgement of Him, and that we're really like taking the Birkat ha-mazon that each of us would have done separately and privately, and we're making it a communal ritual, which, by the way, originally, ideally, the mizamin, the person who led, used to recite all of Birkat ha-mazon out loud for all of the participants, which is not as much done today. Sometimes you'll see
in Ashkenazi communities.
Yeah, then I say that, and sometimes you'll see someone do that for like al ha-michya. You don't see it done as much in the Ashkenazi world when it comes to benching. But recently I was at an event where one person benched and everyone else like just really concentrated. I think it was a community where they really followed the practices of the Grav, the Vilna Gaon, and it was interesting to see that like all of a sudden I noticed, hey, I'm the only one. Like I didn't realize that everyone else is just listening, because it's not what we see done a lot. Now, when it comes to this idea of Zimmun, the Gemara in Brachot explicitly states that all are obligated in Zimmun, and that a group of women eating together also recite their own Zimmun, which I think a lot of people are going to find surprising, because there's this sense, sometimes there's this impression that women today making a zimmun is some kinds of modern day,
It's like
innovation, feminine practice. And it's not the case, meaning the practice of women's zimmun is explicit in the sources. And some even interpret the Gemara to mean that women are obligated, that they are obligated to make a women's zimmun if they ate together in a group of 3 or more women. And I'll tell you, again, in communities, even Haredi communities that are very allegiant to the psakim of the Gra. Since the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, was one of the big poskim who believe that women are obligated, like it's just a given that the women in those communities, when it's three of them, they'll bench together even on a coast, like even with a cup of wine. And it's like, one time when we were talking to someone in the community like that, and we're like, oh, sometimes in the Orthodox world and the Tudumi world is thought of as feminine. She's like, I don't understand. Like, this is halacha, So it's interesting that how things have developed. Now, it perhaps has developed that way because there are other poskim who interpret the Gemara to mean that women can opt in to fulfill the mitzvah of Zimmun as an enhancement of Birkat ha-mazon when they ate with other women, but that they're only obligated to be part of a Zimmun when they ate with three or more men. Now, either way, like nobody says that they are prohibited. Like the question is just, are they obligated, or is it something that they could voluntarily do? Over time, the Ashkenazi practice in particular developed towards women benching individually, even when they eat together, and not making a Zimmun, not because, again, it's very forbidden, but because maybe it just wasn't socially reinforced or expected. Maybe it has to do with how literate people were, who knows, but it didn't develop that way. And still, it's important for us to remember that the halacha, as it's brought down, is what it is, that all are obligated in this. And many authorities even emphasize that three women who ate on their own, like, again, even if they're not going to do it in an obligated kind of way, they're still permitted. And I would say even encouraged. That seems to be like the way that most commentaries think. And for me, this is really significant because going back to, I think, the episode that we did on communal prayer, where you mentioned that we see that the halacha values the shared religious voice and the shared religious experience also of women, also when it's just groups of women. So we see that here, that women joining together in tefillah, women joining together in opportunities to call out to Hashem and to thank Him, is something that our halacha takes note of. And when we have three women who ate together, even if they ate with a group of three men, they're also allowed to make their own zimun. So that's something like when I have students over, and my husband will always say, do you want to make your own zimun? Because it's an opportunity for women to lead, in that. And sometimes yes, sometimes no, sometimes like, no, we'll just all make it together. The only time that women, are obligated not to split off, even if there's three women, is if there's more than 10 men, because then we add in the word Elokeinu, and it takes on added meaning. So then we want women to participate in that as well.
Totally. I think it's really fascinating what you were describing before about that community of the Gra, how in some communities, even today, I would still say that the vast majority of students who even walk into the institution that both of us teach at do not grow up making a Zimmun. No. And they come in and it's like, oh, it's this practice that this place that now we do that. And I think that that's really fascinating because it's really black and white in the Gemara. So it's interesting that it takes on this additional tone that I think is chaval also. I think it's really unnecessary. And I think that that's it's just unfortunate. And I think that I also just want to highlight two important points that kind of follow up and connect to some of the points that you made just now. The first is that Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, again, a very significant Ashkenazi posek in Israel, and this I think is really sometimes eye-opening for people. And he rules that the men present, let's say, assuming it's two men or less, they should answer to the woman's zimun.
Yes.
And it's not like, if she says Chavrotan Avrech, which we'll talk about in a minute,
they may be obligated.
Exactly, they should answer the Zimmun. They're not like, oh, that's a woman's thing. Meaning they should answer the Zimmun just like she would answer the man's Zimmun. And so even if this is not something that women in his family typically do, if he's at a table, women are making the Zimmun, then he should be answering. And the second point is that women who have eaten in the presence of three or more men should participate in their Zimmun and respond to it. There seems to be also this practice that happens, the men are going to make Zimmun and then they'll be cleaning the food in the kitchen or talking with each other.
Right. Meaning the women are not present.
They're not present at the table, or they don't see themselves as being connected to that event that's happening. So there is significance to everybody being part of the Zimmun and benching together. Again, whether or not the women are leading it and there's, those one or two men that are there, or there's there's a men's Zimmun and the women are at the table, like everybody should be present at the table when the Zimmun happens.
That's such a huge point, and so not the culture right now in our communities. Like Zimmun has been thought of, I think, as a male thing, and like the women will answer if they're sitting there, but they don't realize that they're actually obligated to be there and to partake in that.
And I also want to say, in connection with what you just said before, if 3 or more women that were over bat mitzvah missed that event, then they should make their own Zimmun, right? They should sit down and make their own Zimmun as well. And so I think that piece also is maybe somewhat new sometimes for people. And also because Zimmun can be obligatory for women. Okay, so again, women should make an effort not to bench on their own. This just happened to me, by the way, 3 times in the past 4 days, like where I really wanted to do a Zimmun. It happened last Shabbat. Someone was at my table and just didn't think about it. So she benched, and then we didn't have a Zimmun anymore because there were 3 women. And then also just now, whatever, a few times on a Tziul. It just kept happening because it's like, it's kind of a consciousness raiser of like, let's do this thing together, you know?
Right. And women are not in that mindset. For them, benching is usually a private affair.
No, exactly. So that I think is significant. One other piece, which I think also sometimes can be new, is that we still, it's a good thing still to answer to a Zimmun, even if you weren't in that meal with them, which is significant.
Right.
So even if you were in that meal, then the Gemara still says that you don't necessarily say the exact same text. I mean, you can say, you don't say Baruch she'achanu mishalo because we didn't eat, but you could say Baruch umvorach shmo tamid olam va'ed, which is slightly different. But meaning again, if the Zimmun is happening, we all want to be taking place, we want to be taking part in that event. And I think that's also new for people.
Meaning that you're referring to someone who didn't even eat at all at the meal, because someone who did eat at the meal, even if they didn't wash and they didn't have bread, they could participate fully and say, shachanu bishalo. Yeah, they didn't eat bread, but they ate, You're talking about someone who just happened to wander into the room.
Walked in randomly.
Yeah, my boys actually told me that they heard in school a cute little acronym from Rav Avad Yosef to help remember this line. He said that, like, anyone who forgets what to say should either, feel embarrassed. So in Hebrew, that's bushet lo, that he should have some embarrassment, and bushet lo is Baruch umuvarach shemo tamid olam va'ed. I mean, it's an acronym. Yeah, I thought that was cute. It's a little, those things are helpful because it's not something that comes up often, and then you're like, here I am, but I don't even know what to say. So that's a little helpful tip.
Okay, so to come back to this piece about women making their own Zimmun and why we may not see it done more often, I think it's worth thinking about it a little bit. As we said, halachically, it's not particularly saying Birkat ha-mazon. That was clear. Women making their own Zimmun, that even if we don't follow the opinion that women's Zimmun is obligatory, it still remains a very, very clear halachic option and definitely something that's good to embrace. Right? Meaning, there's nothing that's preventing us from embracing it. And I will say that from
no opinion that looks down on it.
No. But we do know that within the Ashkenazi world, from Balei Tosafot to the Aruch HaShulchan, which is already in modernity, that it was kind of uncommon for women to say it. So we know that it didn't have mazal in that same way throughout many centuries for women. And there, as we said, there could be a whole host of reasons. It could be due with a lack of education. Maybe they didn't know the Hebrew, right? Throughout most of Jewish history, people weren't reading or reciting things in the way that we do now.
The literacy.
Yeah, the literacy, as you mentioned earlier, also was an issue. And I think that women just may not have known that it was a valid possibility. And that as it sort of kind of got revived in the past, several decades, I think a lot of times it got caught up in this notion of, as we said, of more like feminist ideology, or women leading something automatically makes people think about like her being a chazan or a chazanit or something. And it kind of like brought with it overtones that have nothing to do with the actual halachic root of what the practice is. And I think that even today, we certainly can see that women are, they don't want to say a Zimmun because they feel like it's going to like label them in some sort of like feminist light, which is just bichlal sad to me in terms of like the beauty of the mitzvah. And I think the other side of this is that it is important also to honor people's customs, like to force Zimmun and to make someone feel uncomfortable. Like that's also not
something practice. Our mothers or grandmothers did, and there are communities that don't do it. So we could respect that, but we at least want them to understand kind of the background of this, and not to look down on people who do it and think that it's something not halachic or not acceptable.
And also, I do think, Shana, that educationally it should be taught to young women when they're young, like just like you teach young women that we say Birkat ha-mazon and we say these brachot. It should be more encouraged, not as now I'm 18 or went to a seminary, now I do this thing or don't do this thing, and then I make up a name for it called a mizumenet, which is a fake name. Meaning, it should be encouraged when kids are little, right? As women, a girl gets to bat mitzvah age, Eza Yofi, like now you can be part of a Zimmun. Like to me, it should just be part of.
Boys lead the Zimmun at their
Exactly.
bar mitzvah celebration.
Exactly. It should just be a practice that's ubiquitous, I think.
Yeah, I actually went looking for it because I had this like faint memory of an article that my mother, Rebbetzin Abby Lerner, had written, and I went looking for it, and I found it on the internet that in 2000. So I remember that I thought I was in college at the time, so I was 21. She wrote this piece for something that was called the Orthodox Caucus, which was like a little group that had gotten together, and they put out a small pamphlet of a collection of articles on orthodoxy and feminism. And in my mother's piece, she wrote these lines, which were like really interesting to read now. She wrote, "Every now and then, as my 4 daughters sit at the Shabbat table with me and my husband, the discussion is opened about whether or not we as women should bench with the women's Zimmun. This practice was viewed quite favorably by the Vilna Gaon and was endorsed by such gedolim as Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. So far, my daughters have turned down the option as being too feminist. They recognize the halachic validity of the act, but they simply do not want to be associated with the anger of the feminist movement. It makes me sad to feel that we would not participate in what might be a spiritually fulfilling act because we feel that it has been revived by some who do not always share our reverence for all of the rabbinic law." That was really fascinating because, like, in terms of where things are now,
it's changed so much.
Yeah, it hasn't changed so much, and we're more than 25 years later. And also, I was like, wait, there was a time where, like, my mother was, like, the progressive one that was maybe, pushing for this, and we, the daughters, were like, no, we don't want to do it. We don't feel comfortable. It's weird or whatever. So, no, I think pretty soon after that, and maybe after she wrote that, maybe we discussed it more. But I that was in 2000, and I remember, like, I got married in 2002, and we were already, like, doing Z-Men, because I remember when my husband entered the family, it was like baror, that, like, just like my father answers.
Maybe the article changed your life, Shana.
Maybe. But I think maybe also there was an understanding that perhaps the best way to deal with discomfort is by making it more mainstream. Like, again, we're not talking about an action here that has any kind of like halachic issue or halachic problem. So maybe like if we understand that and we leaned into it and we say that this is halachic and we start doing it, so then maybe it will become more normal. And I think we do see that that is true in certain circles, that it has become more standard. And at the same time, as you said, not so much has changed. There's still a lot of hesitation. There's a lot of awkwardness. There's discomfort. And especially if you're at a meal where there are 2 men, or one, and there's 3 women, but you're like, are they going to want to answer? Are they not? And then you're not sure. Like sometimes at those meals, like I don't want to be a source of discomfort for people, so I'll just elect not to, not to start it. Which is sad. I'll forego the Zimmun because I don't want to create tension. Because of that lingering feeling that somehow maybe this isn't from. And I think maybe part of what we wanted to do here is just really like put the facts out there on the table so that we know that sometimes those decisions are not necessarily coming from a halachic place. They're coming more from these social like anxieties and tensions that people feel. And women hopefully will feel more comfortable answering a Zimmun, even if they don't want to be the ones to lead it.
Yeah. I think another piece that also makes Zimmun sometimes feel complex for women is we're not actually sure what to say because there's an issue in terms of the wording, right? So let's just make that point clear, which is, first of all, the actual Zimmun, that statement really only starts with Nevarech she'achanu mishalo. All the parts that come before are not part of the halachic element of the Zimmun. They're Rabbatai Nevarech. And why is that significant? Because that is something that can be changed, meaning it's not part of it. And therefore,
you're saying it's not a set established text.
It's not a set established text. And so that part can get shifted. So for example, some people say Birshut, right? Or they'll add something at the beginning, and there's not like uniformity about that. And that's fine. And so when we say for women, so first of all, I think it's important to recognize, and this is something I'm taking from the really wonderful Sarah Rudolph, where it's written on the Deracheha website, where she says that, very often in the benchers, in the Birkonim, there isn't a parallel text, right? Many times younger boys are learning to say Zimmun, so they really read the text inside because they're remembering the words. Not everyone remembers it immediately by heart, but it doesn't have a parallel. And so there isn't chavrotai, which is essentially, my female co-patriots, or however you want to translate it. It doesn't say it in the Birkon. So that also is what it makes it. It makes it continue to feel like, I don't know, going against practice to a certain degree. I will say that for Sephardi women, it's actually much simpler because the text is different, and it just says Birshutchem, and they can just say Birshutchen. Okay, so it's using the same word just to feminize the word itself. And so when it comes to women, as we said in the Ashkenazi text, it says Rabotai Nevarech, which can be looked at just like a general politeness. There's nothing wrong. A woman could say it if she wants to. There's nothing wrong with saying it, but she could also shift it. So two pieces. One is that a woman who's leading a Zimmun could also say Charotai Nevarech, okay, if she wants to shift it to only address the women that are with her. One other piece that has to do with women, but not about women leading Zimmun, is the idea that often when we say Bershut, we say, Balabait or Balatabait, right? A man who's leading a Zimmun will ask permission from those sitting there. Now, that's also, you see a difference. You see people who will only address like the man, or they also will address the woman. I just want to say that when people grow up in a setting or they're exposed to settings where only the men at the table are acknowledged, when again, there's no halachic significance to those words themselves because they come before the Nivarech Shachanu Mishalo, that I think also it sort of enforces this idea that the women are not part of that setting. I think that it is ra'ui, it is mat'im when someone says, Bershut Balabait and Balatabayit, right? And they recognize the both the man and the woman, if that's the household. Of course, they're in. As a gesture. Again, obviously different tables have different people leading them, and then also that there's a shift there.
The people that don't do it, by the way, I think it's because it's like if the Zimmun is being formed by the three men, so they're asking reshut of the other men that they are leading and not them, know. So that's why they're like, oh, well, it doesn't necessarily make sense that you have to mention the woman. But as a gesture, in terms of that we're all part of this meal, I think that is something that is significant and affects the feeling of the meal of like that we're all here together.
Yeah. I also just want to mention that there is this Zimmun card that you can print on the Deracheha website, which has different liturgical options of how you can go about sort of figuring out what feels comfortable for you when it comes to making a Zimmun as a woman. And you can stick it in a Birkat or stick it in your pocket if you want to. And it could be a nice resource also to have.
We have a couple of those in my house. And my husband, who teaches the parak in Masachet Brachot, he teaches this parak of Zimmun to young women in the Deracheha for the year. So he always likes to tell them about that because a big element is the confidence part of it. Like, people don't want to do it if they don't feel comfortable and they don't know what they're saying. So it is also interesting to see how just like printers really affect our Jewish culture also, like the way that they,
and we mentioned that with the bracha of also Shelo Asani Isha and Shasani Kirsono, how
presented,
how Sidurim presented is impactful.
Makes a real impact in our communities. One other question that I also just want to raise here and put on the table is the possibility of men and women creating a mixed Zimmun together. Meaning one woman and two men, or one man and two women, can they combine together to form the Zimmun of three? The Mishnah seems to prohibit it. There is an opinion, Rav Yehuda HaKohen, who allows it, but his view has been widely rejected. And there's basically three reasons why poskim generally seem not to be in favor of a mixed Zimmun for men and women together. The first is that they think that those who are forming a Zimmun should really be reciting an identical text or have the same level of obligation in Birkat ha-mazon. And since we said both of those are questionable, if men and women are both obligated to recite, and if they should say the same exact text, so it could be that that's why they don't think that the Zimmun should be made together. The second is that the halacha may not recognize men and women eating together as having the same kinds of kfiyut, like the same kinds of halachic established status that's needed in order to create a joint ritual. So that's more of like a technical reason. And lastly, it could be that women mixing with men to create a Zimmun may be considered to be improper. So even though someone may say, well, how is that different than women answering a men's Zimmun or men answering a women's Zimmun? There's a difference we see in the halacha between women and men participating in the same ritual as a meal, or men and women together, like creating something, which we see that most authorities are not allowing here.
Yeah, I think that the other like final piece that comes out of this question is a question of a family Zimmun, meaning if you have within a family a father, a wife, and a bat mitzvah age daughter, right, or some other version of that, as I have, then the question becomes: do those reasons, those concerns, do they still apply to that setting? Meaning, we're not concerned about the mixed element. Of course, we have a kaviyut, meaning this is our setting constantly. And so that question comes up as well. And I'll also even say, like, if a Zimmun is representative of like an eating fellowship, like to me, there is I'm saying there is no greater eating fellowship than that setting,
than
your family setting. And so I will say that the majority of Rishonim and Achronim don't either don't allow it or just discourage it. Again, they all, bring in those different reasons with different degrees of severity. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, we've also mentioned, he also did not approve of that. And Rav Digi, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion, we've also mentioned him previously in some of our episodes. He says that it is okay, meaning there's no issue of propriety, and the family is a chavura. It is this fellowship in that official way. But we also should be aware of the sensitivities around it. And, that's not something that is necessarily so accepted in the broader community, and that we should that also is significant to take into consideration those elements of comfort and what people consider to be proper. I will just say personally, since we did already mention that is something that comes up, which is that I actually brought this up in my home last year. My daughter was already bat mitzvah for a few months, and it was something that kind of bothered me, to be honest. And I brought it up, and I was speaking to my husband about it, and he said, I guess you could decide, meaning we could do it, we could not do it. And we did it twice. But there's like this internal kvetch you have when you know you're doing something that people don't really do so much. And even though I feel like my motivation, I don't like even the question of what are your motivations. We make a Zimmun because we eat together and this is our family. And what bigger fellowship is there than this? But there's something awkward, internally, about doing something that isn't necessarily done so much, and that if someone would walk in on you, they'd be like, huh, that's interesting. Now, that's true about so many things we do in our lives, so I'm not sure if it matters. But so we did it twice, and we haven't made it an official part of our life. But I think also because my husband said to me, I want you to look into the sources of it more, because I want us to think about this more before. And so it's something that's still a question and a work in progress. We'll see what we decide to do. But I'll also just say, which is that when it comes to saying a Zimmun, I kind of have a policy, which is that when there are 3 women, I don't really ask. I don't ask people, are you comfortable with it?
Just lead it.
I just lead it. Meaning I don't ask them to lead it,
Mm-hmm.
but I want in this reality that this is what we do. So I don't, I know, of course, that sometimes people will be like, oh, they do that here, or that's awkward. But I kind of purposefully ignore it. Again, not because I want people to feel uncomfortable, because I want this to be a normative thing.
In your home, it's just
in my home, this is what we do. So I just lead it. I don't ask anybody to lead it, but I don't ask their permission. And I'm saying that here because I think that a lot of times people, they struggle with that piece. I want to say Zimmun, or we usually say Zimmun, but we have these guests over and we don't know, or what will they think? And I'm not starting to poll people. Most people haven't looked into the halachic element of it either. So if I know that it's fine and this is my home, then I'm going to start it. And then everybody will answer. It'll be what it'll be. It never leads to a discussion. I don't have a discussion.
No one ever has walked out on you.
No one's walked out. Yeah.
So we also don't do this in our home.
The family Zimmun.
Yeah, the family Zimmun. I think, first of all, it was only a issue for 2 years because I have 4 boys and a daughter. And once my son came bar mitzvah, my oldest, so then, there were a couple of years where it was just him and my husband and me, where it was relevant. But then, I don't know, it just didn't come up. And then my other son became bar mitzvah, and very quickly we had a Zimmun. And then for a very long time, every single meal as a family had a Zimmun because of my sons. But actually lately it's resurfaced because my 3 oldest boys are all in yeshiva. And all of a sudden we have many meals that it's just Judah and me and my younger son and daughter. So even though we're 4 people and 4 adults who are over the age of bar and bat mitzvah, all of a sudden we don't have a Zimmun. Now, I can't say that my kids seem to mind too much. They're like, oh, no Zimmun. We don't have to stay until the end of the meal, It kind of all of a sudden is an excuse for them to binge when they want and say, oh, I'm going to the couch or I'm going to sleep. So I'm like, wait, what happens? What happened to the Zimmun? So we were actually recently discussing it. And it's, again, not something that we do, also because of that understanding that there's a majority of opinions who discourage it.
I really love this topic. Yeah. Saying that truly.
It's not as much as provocative or whatever,
no, but I think the undercurrents of this, exactly, it's a day-to-day mitzvah, and the undercurrents of what fuels the different practices, especially when it comes to Zimmun specifically, is, I think, interesting and speaks to where people hold within the Jewish world. And while maybe that doesn't have halachic basis in the same way, meaning it maybe should be simple halachically, but I think that a lot of these pieces about, how people feel about women's involvement in all different kinds of things ends up making its way kind of mysteriously, but ends up making its way into this practice. And I think that these questions and where we stand in relation to them are really significant. What's your takeaway from our conversation today?
I think just in general, this conversation, discussion, and the preparation that I did for this episode was a really good reminder for me of all the meaning behind these words, of all the significance that really exists in Birkat ha-mazon, and the opportunity that it does provide for us to step back and be grateful for all the aspects of our day-to-day life that maybe too often, I'll speak for myself, I take for granted. And I think the very concrete, practical things, like the fact that we have what to eat, that we have Deracheha, that we have this land that Hashem gave us, that He entered into a brit with us, that He gives us a lot of gifts. I think as somebody who is not always good, it's come up before, of at slowing down and at taking time to reflect, being reminded that like benching maybe is an opportunity to do that. Like take a moment, eat at a table, as you said, like before you even get to the benching, take a moment to like just give yourself a break for 5 minutes to eat and to like be present and to think intentionally about what you're doing. And then as an extension of that, to also bench and to say Birkat ha-mazon with intention. When you grow up saying brachot and being raised to bench, so the benefit, as you said, is that's more easily part of your routine. Like it's rare that I'll forget to bench. It happens, but like it's, usually I'll remember to bench, but do those words have meaning? Do I think about them? Do they actually like hit me in a real kind of way? Or am I like mumbling some words? Jews are very good at like mumbling words. Recently I was watching something where they were saying, somebody who's a Baal Tshuva or who came to religion later in their life. So like they say brachot with intention and with meaning. And you could tell when someone grew up religious or observant because they're kind of just like mumbling it into their breath. And it's like, it shouldn't be like this. So it was a reminder of that. And I'm going to try to commit. I already started to saying Birkat ha-mazon from a bencher, like having the text in front of me.
Because call from Judah about all your new commitments.
No, but the minute that you like actually open the words, whether it's on your phone or on a bencher, like automatically you're going to concentrate a little bit more. So, and also like I think I know Birkat ha-mazon by heart, but sometimes it's like all of a sudden you find yourself.
I always mess it up. I have to have the words. I always mess it up.
Just taking out Birkon and like doing it from inside is something that I'm going to try to incorporate into my life as a way of really reflecting more. What about you?
Okay, I think I'm going to sound like a broken record, but maybe we'll just say that it's an important piece of my belief system. First, I think when it just comes to the Zimmun piece, is that I really encourage women to take a seat at the table. Right? Tartei mashma. Take a seat at the table and make a Zimmun if you can. Especially those who are closeted. I want to make a Zimmun, women listening, but I feel uncomfortable, or I'm going to make people are going to think I'm weird or whatever it is. Like, I just want to just own it. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, we have very clear Shabbat rituals. On Friday night, we do a specific like chidon, like questions for the parsha. We have, kid X or kid Y reading from the parsha. Obviously, these things shift over the years, right? But where we are right now for a while, and that's like our Torah at night. During the day, we learn from Hilchot Shabbat of Deracheha, and we have another thing we do. Those are the things we do. When people come to us for a meal, we do those things. Like, we don't not do them. And does everybody want to learn Hilchot Shabbat? I don't know, but that's what we do at the table. So like also like Zimmun, it's actually a halachic ideal, So I really want to encourage women to just like own it, and definitely within the remove the stigma, and definitely within your family, have that conversation so everyone's like kind of on the same page. But I really want to encourage women to do that. It's really beautiful, and as I said, no one's ever like left my table, from the fact that I just let it roll, And when it comes to the actual benching piece, so I'm going to bring back in that word habit, like. Leave the benchers around. We always have like benchers in the drawer in the kitchen. So like no one has to be like, oh, I don't have it nearby, or it's really close. Like it's all here. You know what I mean? So making it easy and accessible, and just trying to, again, when kids are little, it is hard, but like saying things out loud, I think is really helpful. I really enjoy it. Like I love saying the shorter ones. I'm saying the shorter bracha not with my kids out loud. Like to me, it's really fun. Like there's something really nice about it, and it feels campy, but like in your kitchen. So I just want to encourage all of us to try and make it, again, you're saying to rise above the habit and focus on the words. And I really appreciate that. And I'm just saying also, I'm just saying that for those of us who were not there on a daily level, like let's just also focus on figuring out how to make it habit. So then we can get to a level of also really focusing on the words themselves. So I know I definitely am, constantly trying to work on it within myself. And also with my kids. So please God, we'll have some food for thought in this conversation.
Whether or not people are listening to this podcast, Yosefa and I are We're taking a lot for ourselves.
We're on a journey, everyone.
Yeah, we are definitely being affected, and it's been great. So thank you. Looking forward to next time. Purim. Hard to believe.
Me too, Shayna. Did this conversation move you or cause you to think about the topic in a new way? Please share these episodes with friends and family and start conversations about meaningful mitzvah observance. Make sure to check out the show notes for links on how this topic is discussed on Deracheha.org. Contact us with thoughts and questions at womentalkingmitzvot@gmail.com. Looking forward to our next conversation.